Today, we're digging into the story of a man who was, to put it mildly, a walking contradiction. His name was Professor Zacharias Tanee Fomum from Cameroon. And he lived two lives, both at the absolute extreme. On one side, he was a world-class scientist, and on the other, a radical spiritualist.
And when I say extreme, I mean, just look at this. On the left, you've got a scientist with a Doctor of Science in Organic Chemistry. That's a huge deal, a higher doctorate than a PhD. He published over 160 scientific articles and supervised more than 100 doctoral theses. But then, on the right, you have the exact same guy founding a global ministry, doing these intense 80-day fasts, and writing over 150 books on things like prayer and spiritual warfare.
So the question is obvious, right? How on earth did one person manage to not just live in, but completely master two worlds that seem like polar opposites? Well, the answer seems to have three main parts, and the first one starts way back in his childhood.
Okay, so part one of the answer, this guy's entire life was built on a bedrock of absolutely radical discipline. And this wasn't something he developed later on. It was hammered into him from day one.
His capacity for self-denial was frankly off the charts, and it was learned behavior. We're talking about a childhood where he'd wake up at 3:30 in the morning to go help his father. For years, he sold peanuts for his mother and apparently never ate a single one himself. That kind of intense, early training basically hardwired his brain for incredible discipline and the ability to delay gratification.
And you can see how he applied that same discipline to his faith. It wasn't just some vague feeling. It was a clear, step-by-step progression. As you can see here, it started with a conversion experience when he was just 10. A decade later, he made what he called an absolute surrender. And a few years after that, he felt filled with the Holy Spirit. Each step was a distinct, deliberate milestone.
And this leads us to the second piece of the puzzle, which is where things get really fascinating. See, Fomum didn't just try to balance his two lives, he actually fused them together. He created what you could almost call a science of faith. This one quote tells you everything you need to know about how he saw the world. For him, there was no conflict between faith and science. None. He saw his laboratory work as a form of spiritual worship, a way of following a command from the Bible to subdue the earth. In his mind, Jesus was the director of research and he was just the deputy director, carrying out the work.
He took this scientific mindset and applied it to everything, even prayer. He didn't just pray and hope for the best. He collected data. He kept these incredibly detailed journals, where he documented over 50,000 specific prayers that he believed were answered. Think about that. It's the impulse of a scientist, to measure, to document, to verify, applied directly to his spiritual life.
And this thinking shaped how he taught others. He didn't just talk about faith in abstract terms, he broke it down into a clear, repeatable process. He laid out this four-step path. You start as a sinner, you become a convert, then a disciple, and finally, your job is to become a disciple maker. He essentially created a spiritual protocol, a system that was easy for people to grasp and, more importantly, to replicate.
So, what happens when you combine that intense, forged-in-childhood discipline with a worldview that completely merges science and faith? Well, you get an output that is just staggering.
Just look at these numbers side by side. It's almost unreal. Over 160 scientific papers and supervising over 100 PhD and master's theses, and at the same time writing more than 150 books that have been translated into almost 100 languages. We're not talking about a job and a hobby. We're talking about two simultaneous, high-impact, full-throttle careers.
And his writing wasn't just a random collection of thoughts. It was systematic. You can see from his major book series that he was building an entire curriculum for his followers. He had a series on Christian maturity, one on prayer, another on personal discipline, and one on leadership. He was methodically creating a complete framework for his movement.
And he lived this stuff. It wasn't just theory. Get this, he practiced something he called self-imposed poverty. By the end of his life, he and his wife were reportedly donating 92.5% of their total income to their ministry. That's taking belief to a whole other level.
So you have this incredibly disciplined, prolific, and radical man. What kind of legacy does someone like that leave behind? Well,
This is where we find the final and maybe the most puzzling part of his story.
The organization he founded, the Christian Missionary Fellowship International, or CMFI, grew from what was basically a small prayer group into a massive global entity. Depending on the source you read, it has a presence in over 100 nations. We're talking all over Africa, Europe, North America, with thousands of churches all around the world.
Now, the growth of CMFI is a huge deal because it's a perfect example of something experts call reverse mission. For centuries, the story was Western missionaries going to Africa. Fomum's movement flipped that script completely. It's a movement born in Africa that now sends its own missionaries back to evangelize places like the United States and the United Kingdom.
But here's the strange part. Despite this huge global footprint, there's almost no outside analysis of Fomum or his work. We found one rare academic review of just a single one of his books. It raised some pretty standard theological critiques, pointing out his literal reading of Genesis, his focus on the sinner's prayer instead of baptism. But it's important to remember, this is a tiny critique of just one book out of more than 150.
And that leaves us with the final, nagging puzzle. Here's a man who built a global movement, whose books have reached millions of people in dozens of languages, and yet he remains almost a ghost in the academic and theological worlds. Why is there such a massive disconnect between his claimed influence and the almost total lack of external study? That is the great unresolved question at the heart of Zacharias Fomum's double life.